and welcome to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And welcome back to the Bistro.
Yeah, here we are. It's the Thanksgiving episode.
Well, we're recording this the day before Thanksgiving, but it's for Advent.
Right, so, it is an Advent episode, really. But
it is an Advent episode.
We're doing Thanksgiving kind of things, although you have some illness in your family. So
we do. We have received the gift that keeps on giving, which I believe is influenza type A. I haven't got it, but our kids. Right. So anyway, we're taking it easy at home, and so
I'm actually cooking a turkey while I'm doing this. I'm a multitasker. I'm recording this episode and cooking a turkey at the same time.
Oh my gosh! Maybe I'll succulent?
Maybe I'll upload pictures. My turkeys come out really nice. I'm just saying.
Do they? It's not like National Lampoons where they cut it and it cuts open.
No, it's a beautiful turkey. It's moist. It's delicious.
Wrong podcast. Okay.
Stay tuned and we'll give you the turkey recipe for.
Oh, the turkey recipe you've all been dying for.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
what do you like for sides for your Thanksgiving?
I am dressing. Like I'm a huge dressing fan, and my mom makes some that I really enjoy. And you always ask her for the recipe. Yeah, you ask her for the recipe, and she's like, "I don't know. I just put some stuff in the pan." And I
like her spaghetti recipe. I'm a big fan of that. What was that stuff? What was that other stuff we had that one time? It was really good.
The other stuff we had that one time.
It was mixed, some stuff mixed together. I don't remember what it was. It was good, though.
That is the essence of every recipe. There was some stuff mixed together, and it was good.
Well, anyway, we have several good things that we eat for Thanksgiving. But anyway, we're thankful for our listeners.
Yes, we're thankful that you're joining us here post-Thanksgiving, that you've held on with us after our devil episode, the Satan episode.
To hell with the devil.
The hell with the devil. We had some great feedback on that. Yeah. People liked it. Thinking about I haven't
listened to it yet. Did we get to add a little striper in there, or was it?
I'm sorry.
No post-production? Oh.
But I want to say this. If you'd like to join us on Patreon, we would have more money to pay for rights to Striper, and we can insert it in this podcast.
I thought you were going to say if we raise enough money, then we will do a cover. You and I will do a cover.
Oh my gosh!
Striper's to hell with the devil.
If we get 50 patrons, this is a large pull. 50. I'm listen. If we're going to do a cover of Striper and put on spandex and put on hair and really go for it. We got to have.
No, I didn't say we were dressing up like Striper, but anyway.
Well, I will dress up like Striper. So this is your chance, everyone. Gather around.
There you go.
Go to our website. Support the Bistro.
I'll work it up on guitar, and I don't know.
And I'll
play some keyboards or
something.
Bass,
we'll make it happen.
Okay. Anyway, enough of that. It's Advent season.
It's Advent, and we're jumping into it here.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. So we did Advent last year, just kind of some short reflections, and it was well received. And then this is kind of the end of our season, the way that we work these. So this will be the end of season 2, and we'll take a little hiatus to work up some material and to plan some. We have some good interviews coming up, and so
we can work out some new jokes. Maybe to keep you entertained at the beginning. Yeah, no.
Well, I wouldn't be hopeful for that. Maybe I could ask for a new joke book for Christmas. But anyway, so what I thought I would look at, we looked at 4 prophecies last year when we looked at Advent, and I'm looking at 4 prophecies again this year, and basically I'm using the standard lectionary. There are all 4 from Isaiah this year. I think maybe I mentioned to you earlier that Isaiah I preached through earlier this year in the congregation where I serve, and Isaiah, of course, 66 chapters. There's a lot you can do in Isaiah, and so all 4 of these passages we're going to be looking at during Advent are from Isaiah. I think I've mentioned this before. There's one of the early church fathers that calls Isaiah the 5th gospel. Have I mentioned that before?
I think so. Yeah.
And, we find Isaiah quoted so much in the Gospels, and so much of it seems to be a reference to Jesus. So a couple of interesting things. So the first week of Advent, and again, Advent is just this time leading up to Christmas where we remember the way that the anticipation for Jesus was there, and also we have that same anticipation for his return. I'll remind you that it's a time of waiting, it's a time of expectation and anticipation is what's going on. And the first week of Advent is usually centered around hope, the theme of hope. And so that's what this passage here is from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. That's what the lectionary gives us for the prophecy for this week. Let me go ahead and I'll read this, and then I'll have you read Micah 4 a little bit later. But
okay.
Verse 1 says, "This is what Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem." And I'll stop there just to say this. It's interesting. It's an interesting wording here, because literally what it says is, this is the word that Isaiah saw. So it's kind of a mixed metaphor there in a way. This is, when we have a prophet talking about seeing something, we usually call that visionary, a vision. Right. And so this is the word that Isaiah saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And then verse 2 says, "In the last days," we should probably come back and say something about that phrase, but in the last days, "the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." So there's this passage from Isaiah 2, and again, we're thinking about the theme of hope. In a way, the whole season of Advent is a time of expectation, a time of waiting. We're thinking about the way that God's people waited for a long time for this promised Messiah, and that's really what's being talked about here. This time when God was going to send this King who was going to judge with righteousness, and things were going to be different than they had been before. So during the season, we put ourselves in an attitude of waiting and an attitude of expectation. God had made these promises to his people, yet there was still a time of waiting. Now, the interesting thing about this, to me at least, this interesting thing about this Isaiah 2 is there is almost an exact parallel in Micah chapter 4. Now, Micah we've talked about a little bit previously, but Micah is a contemporary of Isaiah. In fact, if you look at Micah chapter 1, verse 1, we're not going to read it today, but it talks about that Micah's ministry took place during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And of course, that's parallel to Isaiah's early ministry. You might remember the year that King Uzziah died is chapter 6 and kind of Isaiah's calling. And then we see Ahaz is the theme, as we've talked about before, of Isaiah chapter 7. And then later on, Hezekiah. You might remember the episode we did on Hezekiah's prayer. It's actually been a very popular episode, surprisingly. But that is during the period of Isaiah chapter 36 through 39, in that period of time. So Micah is a contemporary of Isaiah, but read Micah chapter 4, and I want you to notice the similarities and see if you can pick out any differences in what you heard in Isaiah chapter 2.
All right. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples, and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war any more. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. All the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever."
That last part of Micah 4 is part of the difference we see. We see it kind of end in a different way, but other than that, it's pretty similar. Do you see the similarities? Did you notice any other differences there?
Um, that's under their own fig tree. I thought.
Yeah, that ending. Yeah, that ending.
I mean, that whole ending there.
Yeah, that's a different, and I won't say an addition, but there's a question of, did Micah say this first and then Isaiah put it in his book, or vice versa? How do we understand this? Again, they're contemporaries. This word apparently was important enough that it needed to be repeated in that.
Yeah, I don't. Gosh, man, I don't know if there's much else that I noticed that was different. I'm sure there is that you're going to show.
Yeah, well,
me.
it's actually a pretty minor difference. It's the word for peoples is for people is and the word for nations is goy or goyim, and those are transposed in two different places, which is interesting. But again, in prophecy, like Hebrew poetry, we find these parallels that are very, very similar, and so. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially the same thing. So let's talk a little bit about the meaning here. The context, again, both of these are contemporary. Both Micah and Isaiah are writing during the reigns of Jotham and Ahaz. It's a time where the Assyrians were pressing in against the Samaritans, and the prophecies about basically that Samaria is going to be destroyed, but Judah is going to be preserved. But it's a time of relative, I would use the term powerlessness. It's a time for Judah. And that's who Micah is talking to, and that's really who Isaiah is talking to for the most part during their ministries. It's a time where things don't seem like they're going very well, but it's a time where there's this need for hope. There's this need for an expectation that God's promises are gonna take place. So a few things that I want you to notice. Again, if you look at the very beginning of this, in the last days is kind of a general phrase, but it's a future-oriented kind of thing. We still talk about this today. If we talk about, in the last days, we mean in the days that are not yet, in the days that are to come, is what we're saying. And there are some people who will make a very specific kind of chart or outline, timeline of these last days. But really, as I've said before, we have been in the last days. I would say in God's next to last or penultimate part of his redemptive plan from the time of Jesus' ascension, from his resurrection ascension, as we are waiting for his return. So we've been in the last days throughout this entire period of time. The last days, Pentecost, we see that phrase being used. We see it in Paul's epistles. There's this expectation that it's going to be soon. Soon Jesus is going to return, but we're still waiting. We're still in this period of waiting. So again, Advent is a time of expectation, waiting, not only as we think about the way that God's people waited a long time for Jesus to come, but it's also this period of waiting we find ourselves in when we are expecting Christ's return, when everything's going to be made right. So that's in the last days. Then he uses this illustration of the mountain of the Lord's temple. Now, how do we usually refer to the mountain of the Lord's temple? What do we usually call that? I know you know this.
Mount Zion, Temple Mount.
Mount Zion. So the mountain of the Lord's temple, and I'll say this, and I really like the Micah passage. I should have said something about this earlier. You still have Micah 4 there?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We'll come back to those last few verses here in just a minute, so don't move away from there yet. But mountains were associated with places where gods dwelt, right? And I'm just talking in a general sense with all these cultures. Mountains were seen as places where you built temples.
And is this reference like the high places?
Yeah,
like
the
where
high places.
Built altars in the high places.
There's an example. When we talk about the high places, it's saying that these are places that are up, literally up high. It's places where we have temples built. You might think about the temple that the Samaritans built on Mount Gerizim as an example of this. So these mountains are often associated with gods. Even later, and this is a later period of time, but you think about Mount Olympus, and you see what I'm saying? It's this,
right.
It's this idea that the mountains are where the gods live is kind of the idea. But what Isaiah is getting across, again, this is a time where Judah's relatively powerless, but they're looking forward to this time where the mountain of the Lord's temple is going to be exalted. And they're basically, what Isaiah's prophecy here is basically saying is the Mount Zion is not like these other mountains. It is superior. It is going to have a universal, and that's kind of one of the terms I would use here, is a universal appeal, is what Mount Zion is going to be. So you see, it's interesting because the mountains are high places, but it says that the Mount Zion will be kind of exalted. There's going to be this time where it's going to be the highest of the mountains, right? It's not talking about a literal kind of shift, I think, but it more has to do with it's going to be the place that is treated as the most significant and the highest of these places. So that's the first kind of just context thinking about this idea of the mountains are the places where the gods live. Another thing that you might see here in your English Bibles, I know not everybody's following along in their Bible right now, but the word Lord is spelled two different ways. You find Lord with a capital L, but then small O-R-D, and then you find it's called small caps technically, but capital L and then O-R-D in small caps. And there's two different Hebrew words that are behind those. The word Lord with a small case is Adon, which is just the word for sir, or just a word for any kind of title of respect for someone. But the word capital L-O-R-D, we've talked about before, when God revealed himself to Moses, and Moses, this is in Exodus chapter 3, and Moses asked his name, God says, you tell them that I am has sent you. And the word here is Yahweh. It's a word that we don't really exactly know how to pronounce because there is a group of ancient Jewish people called the Masoretes that took it so seriously that they didn't even put any vowel sounds in here, so that they took seriously that admonition, do not take Yahweh's name in vain, right? That literally it's, do not take the name of Yahweh in vain. And so they never wanted to misuse his name. So they would just say Adon, which is just, again, a title of respect. But the word Lord here, basically he's saying that Yahweh is not some, I don't know, tribal deity. It's not, the idea is it's not, he's not just like all these other gods. He is the creator God. And that's really, as we've seen when we talked about Exodus a few weeks ago, that's what we see over and over again as kind of the primary point of the law, because the Israelites are coming in contact with the Canaanites and with these other groups that have their own gods, right? And so what this is saying over and over again is your God is the true God. He is the God who is the creator. He's the one who's over all of these other gods. And so this idea of the exaltation of Mount Zion, the place where his temple is, being exalted above all these other places where the gods dwell, is to show his greatness, that he is the true God over all of these things. So does that make sense, what you see there?
Yeah. I mean, as you're seeing it now, like the Lord's temple will be established at the highest of the mountains.
Highest of the mountains.
Mm-hmm. He's exalted above the hill. Like it's this idea that like this is the temple will be established at the highest. It will dwarf everything else that's around it.
Yeah. Again, not literally being altitude-wise raised above all the others, but in terms of prestige and importance. And again, so I know I keep saying this, but think about this. This is a time where Judah is relatively weak at this point, relatively speaking.
And I was thinking, sorry, I interrupted you. I was also thinking about this, like this message of hope comes in right after Isaiah is also kind of giving them a tongue lashing at the same time because they've walked away. But that's, God saying like, you were beaten down because of this.
Right. And we're going to see this invitation in Isaiah's version. Again, there's a difference between Micah's, the way that he ends this prophecy and the way Isaiah does. But Isaiah kind of ends it with, and some people see this as the beginning of the next section, but with an invitation here. Come, let us walk together in the light of the Lord. Basically, and let me go ahead and then we'll come to this invitation here in a minute. I think we'll see the significance. So there's three ways here at least that we see Mount Zion exalted. This hope. This is, again, it's an expectation, right? It's a promise for the future. It's hope. It's something that will happen in the future. The first is that Mount Zion will be a place of attraction for all people. And again, this is part of this idea that God is not simply the God of Israel, but he is the God of all people. And so it says there's a time coming when all of the nations will come to Mount Zion. And it's this image of them streaming up. We talked about this idea of a highway for our Lord, I think, in another episode, is this idea that Zion, that Jerusalem will be the place that people are streaming to, a place where they're looking to. And it says here's part of this invitation. It says, basically, the nations will say to one another, come, let's go up to the mountain of Yahweh. So it's basically saying that people are going to have this desire. These nations are going to have this desire to go up to Jerusalem, and they're going to worship the Lord there. And so that's the first promise that I think we see. The second is that Mount Zion will be a place, we could say, where wisdom and justice is mediated, is one of the ways we might say this. Basically, it says the law of the Lord is going to come out from Mount Zion, right? The law, and it's the idea of all these teachings. We will learn these things is the part of the language here, so it's going to be a place. He will teach us his ways that we may walk in his paths. So all of the nations are going to learn the way of the Lord. Is the idea? It's going to become a place of what we call it universal teaching or universal wisdom, you might say. That wisdom and righteousness is going to come out from Mount Zion and is going to go to all people, a place of wisdom there. And then the last thing is, and this is kind of the most how do I say this? The most concrete images that we have here in terms of metaphor is that Mount Zion will be a source of peace. So the nations are going to go up there, and it's going to be a place of peace. The image here that's so strong is that the weapons of war are going to be used instead for agriculture and commerce. So they're going to, and this is a famous image, right? Beating swords into plowshares. These weapons are not going to be used any longer for war, but instead they're going to be used for tilling the ground. The spears that would be used to kill another human being are going to instead be used for fishing. They're going to be made into hooks, and so. So there's this idea. Actually, I guess it's technically pruning hooks, right? For pruning. So for
I'll let you run with the fish thing too.
Yeah, I'm just ready for some fishing, but no, an agricultural image, and it's kind of this idea of return to Eden, right? What God intended for His people, what He intended for our relationship with Him. This idea that it would be plenty. And so again, this idea there's going to be tilling, there's going to be pruning, and it's going to be enough for everyone. One just slight thing, and we've talked about what peace means before, and we'll be talking about peace in a couple of weeks as well, because obviously peace is one of the weeks of Advent as well, to think about the promise that God has made of peace. But it's interesting here. It's the way I think we would think about this, and I'm not trying to get political here, so please don't misunderstand this. But
I'll try.
We would sometimes think about peace as coming because weapons were removed. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, it's the removal of the weapons that bring peace. But the idea, the image that we have here is that there will be no longer, because there is this peace, this universal reign of God, of the Lord, of Yahweh, because there's this universal reign, there will no longer be any need for these weapons of war. And so you see the difference there.
It's not the lack of weapons that bring peace. It's the peace that makes the weapons not necessary.
No longer necessary. That's going to be that kind of peace, not an enforced peace, if you will, but the kind of peace that God is going to bring because He's reigning over all the nations. He is the King, and I know that's kind of a fine point, but for me, I mean, just what that speaks to is just so important. And I think the reason is this. This is what it comes down to. And I say this all the time in different ways, but what we try to do by our power, what we're trying to bring about by our ingenuity and our, if you think about these things, our wisdom, our attraction to people, that's missing the point. The whole point is we point toward the Lord God, and He is the one who draws people together, and He is the one who brings wisdom and righteousness and justice, and He is ultimately the one who brings this peace. And we say, I don't need my sword anymore. I'm going to make it into a hoe, and I'm going to plant a bigger garden, so we'll have even more. There'll be this plenty for everyone. That's kind of the image that they're looking toward. Again, Judah think about this. Assyria was a major superpower. Egypt was a major superpower. Remember, they always felt like they were kind of right in the middle of this. And it's no longer are we going to be in that situation. Instead, and that's the highway that we find later in Isaiah. This highway goes from Assyria, to Egypt, and it's through Mount Zion, right? There's this, everybody is coming up to participate here in Mount Zion is kind of the idea. So that's the hope. The hope is, hope is always a future promise, right? In the last days, this is the way things are going to be. These promises then are passed along, I would say, to all of God's people, including us, through Jesus. That's why we read these passages. That's why Isaiah is the fifth gospel, right? That's why we read these passages at Advent. They are a reminder to us that these were looking forward to the time of Jesus, and this universal message is fulfilled in him. And so that's kind of what I'm taking away. I have some things to say about how that works out in our lives then, but any comments or questions to this point?
No, I really appreciate you pointing that out. It's not the lack of it, it's the peace that is the change. Like it's Jesus is the change.
Yes.
Not us changing our circumstance. You know what I mean? Like
exactly.
God changes the circumstances, and then that brings the things that we thought we needed before are no longer needed, and he is the source. Not we don't create it ourselves.
I think the story of Scripture, as I understand it, shows in many ways over and over again when we try to take things into our own hands and try to make things work, that they don't.
Right.
That it's inevitably failure, and you can see that from the Tower of Babel. We'll make ourselves, we'll make a name for ourselves. We'll keep ourselves together. And you see that through Israel's failures. Just one example, the early on in Israel's history, after they leave Egypt, in the Exodus, you see, they fail to trust God when God says we can go in and take these Canaanites, even if they make you look like grasshoppers. And Israel chooses to believe that they're too powerful for them. And then when God says, well, that means you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, they try to do it themselves, and they are utterly defeated. And then obviously the next generation, when they go in with God, walls of Jericho fall. It's just a whole different story. That is repeated over and over again. I think you see it in the New Testament church as well. I think in the book of Acts, when we try to do it our own way, it's unsuccessful. When we keep it in step with the Spirit of God, when we do the things that He has called us to and focus upon those things, then we're in a better shape. So,
and I'm just going to say with this is, like, I think one of the things that I don't want us to get caught in is, like, God is the one that does it, but we have a responsibility in that as well. Like, we are not passive participants in this world.
No, it's
pointing towards, pointing towards Christ. Like that's the mission of the church, is to be reconcilers. We've talked about this before, that, our job is to be reconcilers, even in the world in which we live in right now, pointing towards Christ, who is the ultimate reconciler.
Right. I'll make a point about this in just a minute. I'm going to talk about the three different ways that we do this, but you're absolutely right. Yeah. I'm not trying to say it's just us sitting back and waiting. When I say keeping in step with the Spirit, it's the difference between us trying to do things our own way, trying to use our own wisdom and our own strength, rather than submitting ourselves to God's wisdom and strength. I was going to mention this earlier. Let's go ahead and mention this now. This is Micah chapter 4, verse 5. This is kind of his ending. You mentioned that idea. Everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree. That's that way. That thing of plenty again, right? That everybody's going to be able to cultivate their own vines and their own figs. No one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. And by the way, there's an article on figs in the Smithsonian this month. that I have yet to read, but has been really highly recommended, about figs in the ancient world. I'm getting excited about that. But figs and grapes were really, really great things. But then verse 5, it says, "As all the nations may walk in the name of their gods." Do you see that? They're walking. So that's what I'm talking about. These tribal deities, right? These tribal gods. They may all walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of Yahweh, our God, forever and ever. So that's the primary point, I think, is to show this idea of, the superiority of Yahweh over the other gods, and they're looking forward to this. It's not the gods of the Assyrians, it's not the gods of the Canaanites. It's it's the Lord God that is going to bring these things to pass. So here's kind of, when you talked about us being responsible for this, then here's kind of three things I would see. So first of all, the Mount Zion is a place of attraction for all people, right? And so when you think about I hadn't thought of this till just now, in New Testament terms, this is where Jesus says, if I am lifted up, then I will draw all people to myself, right? So we point toward Jesus, we point toward the cross, and that is the point of attraction. So our responsibility then, I think, is proclaiming that it is now possible for all people, universally, for all nations to have access to God through Jesus now. He has made that way. He has opened up that path that we can now draw near to God with clean hearts and clean hands through what He's accomplished on the cross. So we're called to proclaim, right? Secondly, we understand that Jesus is the source of wisdom and justice, that He is the one that we go to for understanding, that He is the one that we seek truth from, rather than from some other place. And then finally, we believe that Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and that it's only in His return that peace will ultimately come, not an enforced peace, but a peace that comes because He has, the image in Isaiah 2 is that He's judging between the nations, right? He's the one who's going to bring this peace. And I was thinking about this, war in Ukraine continues to go on. They're talking about a difficult winter. We've seen some of the effects even here locally. Jesus says there's always going to be wars and rumors of wars until I return. And so that longing that we have, so that anticipation, that waiting, we trust God's promise. We trust that this is going to take place. But it is a period of waiting until then. And then verse 5 is that invitation I was talking about. So here's what it says in Isaiah 2:5. "Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of Yahweh." So you talked about in chapter 1, He's kind of given him that tongue lashing. You're not living up to what you're supposed to be. And I think here's this idea, okay, God is working, and His promise of future is that all nations are going to stream up. Therefore, Jacob, let us live in the light of Yahweh. Let us walk in His righteousness is kind of the idea, because this is the promise that we have for the future. We get distracted, right? We look at other ways of doing things, or let's get turned aside, of trying to accomplish things in different ways. For me, that's the big if I want to get political, that's the big problem with politics in the United States today, is we are looking, even the church, I think, is too often looking at our political system in order to bring about change, rather than recognizing that hope is found ultimately in Christ, and that the church is the way that God has established through which people are going to come to peace and come to justice with one another. So, other thoughts on that or comments?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's, we were just talking about, I was reading another book, that You Are Not Your Own by Alan Noble, which we might talk about at some point, but it's all about these ways of seeking meaning or purpose in your life. And even like for us in the church, as you talked about, we can look at, we talked about the politics and all that stuff, that we can look at so many different things that are going to bring about what we think is the rightness, or the God's kingdom or whatever. But it is only God who brings God's kingdom. It's not anything that we've established here. Right. And even the church is something outside of here. You know what I mean? Like it is it's a to God thing. And so I think that's a really important thing, and I think that's something that we always have to be considering and thinking about as we reflect on our own lives and what that means.
Well, the passage I'd kind of chosen to then finish this up, in a New Testament passage, Romans chapter 8, and starting in verse 18, I think goes right along with that. And I'm thinking about what you said earlier about the responsibility we have of promoting the kingdom, as we always say. God has established the kingdom in Christ, and we are to be agents of that kingdom change taking place in our lives. I always say, starts with us, families, and our communities, our church communities. That's where these changes begin. And here's how Paul talks about it in Romans 8. I kind of very hopeful, anticipatory language here. I really love. Of course, Romans 8's just.
There's a lot happening.
You can't get better than Romans 8. It's been called for years the high point of kind of the entirety of God's revelation. But I don't know about that. But John's not shabby either. But Romans 8 is pretty good. This last part though, in verse 18, hope is always, as I said, future oriented, last days, right? And so here he says, I consider that our present sufferings. So this is where we are right now. We're suffering. And, of course, he's writing to the church in Rome, persecutions that are happening and will happen. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So God's glory that will be revealed, future-oriented in us. For the creation. And I always say, this work of the kingdom is a universal work. It has to do with even the creation that was affected by the fall, and we'll see this here. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. Okay, and that verse, I think it's one of those we pass over pretty quickly. But the creation itself is waiting for the children of God to be revealed. And when I teach this, I always say, who are the children of God? What do you think? Who are the children of God?
The church, God's redeemed.
Us, right? We are God's children. And so it says the creation is waiting for the children of God to be revealed. And see, I think people think, they start thinking eschatology. They're thinking some kind of angelic thing or whatever. So I always then kind of stop and I ponder this. What is the creation waiting then for? What does it mean for us to be revealed? For if the children of God is indeed us, which I mean, how many passages can we look at that talk about that? John chapter 1, we're children born not of natural descent, right? But
right.
We're children of God. 1 John chapter 3, we're children of God. Galatians chapter 5, you've been made children of God. We're adopted as sons. In fact, the adoption of sonship, Paul mentions again here a little bit later in Romans chapter 8. We are God's children. So what is the creation waiting for, right? I think it's waiting for us to step up and do what we are expected to do. It's waiting for that revelation. So you see this, the creation waits in eager expectation. There's no better definition of hope than eager expectation, right? The creation itself waits in eager expectation for God's children to step into what it means to be God's children, is the way I would put it, but to be revealed. For the creation itself was subjected to frustration. Frustration is this idea that we're not able to accomplish what it is that we are meant to accomplish. So the creation itself had a purpose that God made for it. And it was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. We don't have time. We should come back and talk about this another time. There's different views of who it is that subjected it to frustration. I'll tell you what I think. I think the creation was subjected to frustration because of humanity's choice. You can call it Adam if you want, but it means me and you, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? The creation is subject to frustration. It's not able to accomplish what
because
God meant for it to because of our sin. So, that's the whole thing. Even creation, if you look at Genesis 3, the earth's even the ground's going to produce thorns and thistles now. And we could even look at chapter 4. Anyway, we'll look at that another time.
There's a lot happening there.
A lot going on. Creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but the will of one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So we are even leading, as we've talked about the kingdom, part of it is healing creation itself. It's part of our responsibility. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. Even creation, Paul says, is groaning. Groaning in childbirth, I always say childbearing has to do with pain, and this goes back to Genesis 3 as well. With pain you will give birth to children. God says to Eve there, because of you eating of this fruit that I told you not to eat of it. But the interesting thing about childbirth is that it brings joy. It's pain, but it ends in joy. And it kind of mirrors this idea of our hope, right? We're in present sufferings now, Paul says, but we are looking forward to that glory that will be revealed in us. And so it's that same thing with childbearing. It's a painful experience. It's a painful process, but there's joy at the end of it. But not only so, it says, we who ourselves have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly as we eagerly await our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. So the idea is, even we are waiting to be transformed. We're looking forward to the fruition of the redemption that has begun in us. Paul finishes then this section, it goes on, but hope that is seen is no hope at all, for who hopes what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. And that's what hope is about. That's what Advent, that season, is about. Recognizing God's promises are true. We absolutely trust that God's promises are true, but at the same time, we recognize that we are not yet where those promises have come to fruition. So that's why Advent's a great season. It's born in darkness, as they always say. Advent begins in darkness. Because the people in the Old Testament were waiting for this time of the Messiah. And we now find ourselves in a parallel situation, a cold, dark winter with rumors of war, but we wait because of the promise that we have of the return of the Messiah. So,
yeah, when all things will be reconciled, yes. Creation and weapons, because there is no need. Yeah, in us, right. Mm-hmm. we'll give them up because there is no need.
Yeah, and even our bodies will be redeemed, it says. So thank God for that. So
I'm doing pretty good.
Well, I don't know. I'm gonna have a lot of carbs tomorrow. So.
Well, good for you.
My son said, "Do you think 5 pounds of mashed potatoes is enough?" It's like probably enough.
No, you got to do a whole 10-pound bag.
There's only 7 of us, so
still not enough. All right, man. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
appreciate jumping here to Advent.
It's always nice. Advent season's always a nice time of the year.
Yep, excellent. Well, I'll look forward to coming back here next week.
Yeah, another Isaiah passage.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Brian.
All right, see ya.
Bye.